the 5 minutes buffer up. I think it's time to kick off. And I thought to start with, I was going to use a meme because, the host has disabled attendee screen sharing.
Oh, no.
So I can't do that. Okay, but you might have seen it going around. It's not a meme, it's just two tweets. And one person says, I worked my ass off at Amazon with a hot and sweaty mask on, risking my life while unemployment got 600 sitting on their ass. Make it make sense. And then, so that's someone who's making a fairly common conservative talking point. And then the person who's responding to them is making a pretty regular progressive talking point saying, you're being underpaid by the richest man on the fucking planet and being told the problem is someone out of work getting a couple of $100 so they don't literally die. Now, this reminds me of the debate that happened a little while ago, because we've got Scott Morrison saying that, people are on job seeker because he's got anecdotal evidence apparently that people are unable to get employees because job seeker payments are too high, and that's creating a disincentive. And that's a common talking point, that unemployment creates a disincentive for work. And the left responds by saying, no, we're all good little worker bees. We would hate to get money for free. We'd all love to we'd much prefer to be working than getting an unemployment benefit. And at one point that was made by the woman who is the head of the Social Services Australia, or Social Organisations Australia, sort of an industry group for charity groups, I believe. She said that, look, it's still that even now with the payment with the 550 supplement, so that's $1,100 a fortnight. That's still $550 a week is still $700 is still $200 less than minimum wage. But of course, it's not actually that. So that makes a difference of $200 apparently, but it's not actually that much. It's I remember I did the maths. Once you factor in tax, it's about 150. It's $146 difference a week between minimum wage and the dole. And then, of course, apart from the fact that you have your 40 hours back, you have 40 hours of your week to yourself, you also don't have to pay to commute, right? So the average commuting cost in Sydney, according to a study, the study I got was from 2011 or something like that, but that study showed that the average commuting cost was about $120 a week. So there goes everything. And now you're going to be commuting, 10 hours a week or something like that. You're going to be working 40 hours a week, and you're going to be a grand total of $20 better off, or something like that, when you go from unemployment to a minimum wage job in Australia. So what am I getting to? Well, if you had a universal basic income, then the people who's getting the minimum wage would still also be getting the universal basic income. So it's all upside. And it kind of, I think, squares the circle, because there are those who say, oh, well, the unemployment payment has to go back to a sort of a poverty or a sub-poverty level where people are desperate and can't really live. Otherwise, they won't take the jobs. Or those who say, no, we can keep it high and there's no disincentive, when there is. Now, you could say that it's fine because we want to disincentivize work. We could say that we don't want people to be taking low-wage, crappy jobs. We want it to be hard for employers to fill those roles, because then we don't actually want a bunch of low-value work being done in the economy, that we don't want a bunch of people in call centers stacking shelves, etc. That we want those people to say, no, I'll stay out of the labor force, so that therefore businesses have to find ways to be more profitable, more efficient. They can automate more, and they pay higher wages, right? And that to me is actually a pretty good argument. But it's also an argument for a universal basic income, because as long as the payment's there, it's unconditional. You don't have to be looking for work. You've always got the option of walking away, but you don't lose anything by getting a job. You don't lose the free money. All you're giving up is the time then. So it's a clean deal you can make, that I'm gonna give up my free time and get extra money, not give up my free time to get the same amount of money because I'm scared that my payment's going to be cut off or anything like that. So this is what's been occupying my mind recently. I think that there is something to the conservative point. They call it that there's perverse incentives around conditional welfare payments. But the answer to that isn't to be less generous, it's to be more generous and to give them to everyone, including people who have jobs. So any questions? What do people think about that?
When I hear the incentive to work, that is just poverty. Poverty forces people to work. That's kind of the whole incentive. That's what it boils down to.
That's the current system. That's the current system. But now under COVID, we've experienced a period where the unemployment payment was above the poverty line. It's going to go back to just below the poverty line shortly.
Was the government asked on that, like about the poverty line, about putting a payment below the poverty line?
It's certainly been pointed out. I wouldn't bet that anyone in the media actually bothered to ask it directly to Scott Morrison at a press conference, because getting a job in the media normally is dependent on not asking sensible questions like that. Getting a job in the media sort of relies on the fact that you'll ask the other question and say, isn't it too high? Isn't it too high? Aren't we worried that people aren't going to get to work? What about hardworking taxpayers? Blah, blah, blah. So I'd be very surprised if it was actually put to him as a question in a press conference, but it's definitely been raised by activists and organizers. I'm sure he's aware that it's below the poverty line. One wonders why we have people calculating the poverty line if we're going to set living payments that people are supposed to live on beneath it. So anyhow, I mean the other argument, of course, is that taxpayers have to pay for it. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true that taxes fund spending. I think that's a myth. But that's a whole other debate about economics. It's very relevant to UBI though, because one of the big issues that's raised with UBI is the idea that it's too expensive and we'll have to raise taxes to pay for it. I don't think that that's true, but we don't have to go down that road unless anyone's interested. Hello, Jeff. Thank you for joining us. Jeff says hi to everyone in the chat. So what we were just talking about, Jeff, about whether or not there's perverse incentives with the current, no worries, Jeff. If there's perverse incentives with the current welfare system, and what you hear from the right is that, well, because you can make almost as much money on the unemployment payment as you can with a job, why wouldn't you stay home and not work? And progressives will say, well, no, people love work. They just live to wake up in the morning and what they want to do is set their alarm earlier, and leap out of bed and commute to work so they can spend all day stacking shelves or
the purpose and the dignity and the self-respect. Yeah.
All the purpose and the dignity of doing a job that hasn't been automated yet because human beings are still cheaper than robots.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is an interesting point. I will wander off into economic theory if nobody stops me, unless anyone's got any questions. Josh, do you have a question? You have to come up with a question if you want me to not talk monetary theory.
Let's not go too deep. I worry a little bit that you present it as if that's the only option.
Well, I mean, it's just how I see it. So I'm happy to debate it with anyone. But I find that it's one thing I think that's pretty much accepted by all economists is that the government can't go broke, right? The government, the Reserve Bank magics money into existence. And, there was a great special on The Weekly with Charlie Pickering. It has a section called Lukenomics this week. If I could share my screen, I might play the segment. But what it talked about is, that actually when you go and you get a Medicare rebate, it's actually the Reserve Bank that settles that. So the Reserve Bank is involved in government spending at every level, right? When you go and get your Medicare levy, there's the payment actually comes to your doctor from the Reserve Bank. It's not it's not a matter of it coming out of a Treasury bank account at the time. It's magicked into existence at that moment, and so you're never going to run. Medicare doesn't ever go broke. right? No one ever goes to the doctor and they go, oh, wait, sorry, Medicare doesn't have the money. We've got to wait till next week. And, you know, at a simpler level, it's the Australian government issues the Australian dollar. So we have an infinite supply of them. The reason the blocker is inflation. Yeah, go on, Josh.
Can I just ask if any of the people who aren't myself or Austin's, because Austin runs this event and I run the action events on Saturdays. I just want to ask if anybody else has any questions that they have. Just because in previous events there's been a question. People didn't realize that they were allowed to ask questions. So I just wanted to highlight that they can.
Please.
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think of the raise the rate, abolish mutual obligations type movement? I think there's one called living income for everyone. They don't seem to reference universal basic income anywhere. And I think they seem to lean towards the jobs guarantee type, answer to unemployment. So what do you think of that movement?
Well, I definitely think raising the rate is good. I think it's a good thing to raise the unemployment level permanently to so it's above the poverty line. I don't think it's good for anyone in Australia to be living in poverty. But I do think that it would make more sense to have a universal basic income. Look, Josh, were you raising your hand to interject there? Please go ahead.
Yeah, about the Life campaign, I'm very confused about what they're actually campaigning for, because I've got a post from their Facebook page that says, we want to keep the minimum income for everybody at least 1,100 a fortnight. Anything less than that is not a living income, but we're not demanding that the government pays a basic income to every person, regardless of whether or not they're in work. So it seems like what they're campaigning for is raising the minimum wage.
It sounds
that's not what their other marketing looks like. So I'm super confused about what they're.
To me, that sounds like what would be called a guaranteed basic income. So maybe this is a good time to discuss the difference between.
No, that'd be even for unemployed people, though.
So it's not for unemployed people? Or not
They're
for
sending
employed
very
people?
mixed messages, is what I'm saying.
So I think what they might be trying to communicate is what's called a guaranteed minimum income, which is what Milton Friedman proposed. And so how that works is the second your earned income, you can imagine it as an automated job seeker. So you put, first of all, they're saying the payment goes up to a livable amount, let's say, the 1,100 number. And then what happens is, rather than going to Centrelink and applying, it's all run by the tax office. So the second your income in a fortnight drops beneath that, it gets topped up, right? So you could just call a job seeker streamlined. So rather than having to apply, you just get an immediate top up as soon as your income drops below. So it doesn't go to everybody, but it is guaranteed, and it's not conditional on mutual obligations. It's not conditional on, are you looking for a job? It's not conditional on anything else. It's just, as soon as you stop earning, you get this guarantee.
But is that conditional on your assets as well?
Well, there'd be different models of it, but I don't believe so. I believe it's income as distinct from assets. Yeah. I don't know what Life this campaign are promoting. I don't know if they know what their campaign promoting.
I don't think they know either.
Yeah. Sometimes
the first thing that I saw from them basically said, let's make sure that the current payments stay and let's give it to everybody. And I thought, oh, great, that's a basic income. Like, they're not calling it that, but it is a basic income. And then they're putting out posts saying, but we're not campaigning for people who aren't in work. So I don't know.
Who aren't in work? Are you sure they're not saying who are in work? Oh, it's weird.
They said it. Yeah, hold on. I'm digging through it more.
Okay.
I had a quick kind of exchange with them, and I asked them what would be the cutoff, like who gets the payment and who doesn't. And I didn't get an answer. It was just everyone deserves to live.
My bet is that they can't agree amongst themselves. And so they've chosen language that's vague because it's language that they can all agree on internally. And that happens a lot with activist groups and stuff, because they say, let's be real, no one's going to do what we're saying anyhow, so it doesn't matter if it's not practical. Let's just sort of get as many people to agree with something as possible. And by making it vague, you can, it's like when you're talking about housing Like the government never says what they actually want with housing. They want affordable, expensive housing. They want house prices to stay high, but they also want housing to be affordable. Like it's just this incoherent messaging that comes from the fact that they want to please everybody. But what is a really well thought through proposal is the guaranteed basic income, and the idea of that is that we can respond to that because we actually know what it is, right? And this is a proposal that you only give money to people who need it, right? And so the advantage is you end up spending less. You don't have to put as much money into as many people's hands, and it's automatic. So it's run from the tax office. It was called a negative income tax. That's the Pirate Party Australia. They have this proposal as well. And the idea
is that the Pirate Party's version?
Yes.
Negative income tax.
Yes. And theirs is quite a graceful one. So as you get, the second you're earning below $45,000 a year, you get some negative income tax. And then if you get down to $0 a year in earning, you get you have $15,000 of negative income tax.
Not enough. Too low.
Not enough. It's too low. It's way too low. I agree that's definitely too low. You really only starts to be reasonable at above 20,000, 24, 25, 26,000 is where you start to have a reasonable capacity to keep yourself clothed and fed and warm and so on. But anyhow, and then there's a guarantee. So that's a negative income tax, which is one form of guaranteed minimum income. Then there's another guaranteed minimum income, which is it just kicks in. So say you make it 1,100, a fortnight. If you earn $1,000 in a fortnight, then you'll get $100 topping that up. And if you earn 500, then you get 600 topping that up. And the problem with that is once I get to zero and I'm just living on the guaranteed basic income, there's very little incentive for me to take any shifts or do any work. So there's no reason to do work unless I'm going to get substantially above the 1,100, because I could earn up to $1,000 that fortnight, and what my take home income doesn't change.
It's so much monitoring and bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah.
The advantage could be that there's slightly less bureaucracy because you run everything through the tax office, right? So the thing that happens at the moment is we measure incomes twice, and it's the only reason they do it is to catch people out. So you go to Centrelink and they say, give us your income estimate, and you've got to say how much money you think you made last year, how much you think you're going to make next year. And then they check with the tax office, right? And if the tax office gives a different number, you're in the shit. So the only reason, why not just go with the tax? Why not have the tax office just administer the payments anyhow? That's one step. But the best way to do it is you give every single person, everyone who's got a tax file number gets a basic income. And then you have income tax that comes out, and so that way you only ever measure the income once. You don't have to measure twice and then cross-reference. So if you're measuring and you can actually achieve effective targeting. So if you make it, we don't want to give people say, we don't want to give money to Gina Reinhart. We don't want to give money to people who are making $100,000 a year. Well, you just increase taxes on those people if you're so worried. They're already paying taxes. If you're making $150,000 a year, you're already paying more than $26,000 in tax, right? Your tax bill is already substantial. So we can increase that if we're worried about giving money to people who've already got too much. And you might want to do that because if you want to avoid inflation, for example. But right now, the big problem, what keeps the Reserve Bank and central bankers up at night all around the world, is deflation. They're worried that prices are going to start dropping and that we could have a deflationary spiral like what happened in the Great Depression. So all the arguments against, all these reasons not to hold back and to not give a UBI, there's never been a weaker, the counter arguments for UBI have never been weaker than they are at this moment. Does anyone have questions about that stuff?
I have a question, not specifically about that, but I went to a similar kind of talk a while ago, and it was talking more about a jobs guarantee. Why do you prefer a universal basic income over a jobs guarantee?
Well, because I think that you're actually wasting people's time with a jobs guarantee. I think you're pushing rope. I'm very anti a jobs guarantee. For one thing, I think the whole point of all this technology was that it was going to allow us to work less. So what's why is full employment still the goal? Why that was the goal 70 years ago. Why is it still the goal now after 70 years of technological improvement? What jobs guarantee people will say is that the big problem is involuntary unemployment, right? So that people who want a job but can't find one, and that's really unfair. But what they're not concerned at all about is involuntary employment. So people doing a job that they hate, people doing a job that who don't want to do, who don't want to be in a job at all, who would rather be, writing a novel or surfing or whatever. And so there's a lot of moralistic thinking built into this economic policy. That the problem of not having a job is a valid problem, but having a job that you hate is not a valid problem. What they would say is that I'm being mean, because actually the whole point of a jobs guarantee is because they say they have a very, very benign view of government jobs. So because the federal government's going to guarantee you a job. So if you don't like your job in the private sector, if you don't like working at McDonald's, you can leave and get a job through the federal jobs guarantee. And these are going to be these great jobs. They're going to have good conditions. They're going to have, they're going to be full time, because everyone wants to work full time, right? They're going to be, and everyone,
good. They're going to be clean. They're going to be secure. They're going to,
yeah. They're going to be amazing. And you ask how they're going to administer it, and what they actually say is, well, it would be federally funded but locally administered. So that's a total dodge, because it means what'll happen is you'll go to your local council, and your local council will get money from the government to give you a job. So the people who are now PhDs who are unemployed would instead be PhDs picking up garbage. Or not that you have to have a PhD to be a worthwhile person, but I think there's a huge opportunity cost there. And then there's the problem of then you're providing these services, you're actually going to be putting other people out of work. So Bill Mitchell, who's the leader of the MMT crowd in Australia, that's modern monetary theory, they advocate for a jobs guarantee. He suggests, he's quoted somewhere as I've read him saying, well, someone who's a surfer could surf 4 days a week and then do swim safety classes for kids, and that could be their guaranteed job. Or if you're an aspiring musician, you could give music lessons. And it's like, well, in my town, which is 1,000 people, 200 kids, 50 of whom need swimming lessons, right? We already have a swimming school, and we already have a music teacher. So you start providing those services for free, then those people are out of job, and you're back exactly where you started. Then you've got to find a guaranteed job for those people. And it's, fundamentally as well, is it a job if it's guaranteed? What if I don't show up? What if I show up stoned out of my mind? What if what if there's a drug test and I don't pass it? What if I'm making my co-work, sorry?
Go to jail.
Yeah, go to jail. Or what if my co-workers don't like the way I talk? What if I'm deemed to be making other people in the workplace uncomfortable? A job is conditional. You have to show up, you have to perform certain tasks, you have to behave a certain way, you have to dress a certain way, you have to conform to a lot of different standards. And I'm not saying, oh no, that's terrible. I'm saying that, that's impossible to then combine with the idea of guaranteed, right? So the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is, imagine in the coronavirus situation. So we had at the beginning of it, when we had millions more people become unemployed all of a sudden, we couldn't even get everyone on a payment. There weren't enough call center staff. The websites were crashing. The queues were going around the block at Centrelink, right? And that's just when all you've got to do is prove eligibility and get on a payment. For a jobs guarantee, I beg your pardon, you'd have to prove eligibility. Then they'd have to find a job to put you in. They'd have to set up programs. If your job is going to be, landscaping or whatever it is, they're going to have to get you a shovel, right? So there's this administrative overhead that's huge. There's these assumptions about what is a good life and how a good life should be lived. Now, what they will say though, in their defense of the jobs guarantee, is they'll say that it's a more equal setup. And it is. It is more equal because no one's unemployed. So, universal basic income, the unemployed person is getting their payment, right? And they're not getting a salary on top of it. And then the employed person is getting the payment and getting a salary on top of it, right? And you can tax some of that back, but let's just assume that that's the case. But of course, what's happening there is that the employed person is giving up their time. They've decided, I don't want to keep this time to myself. I don't have some project that I'd like to do. I don't want to be writing a novel or surfing or, spending my time doing any other thing. And they're getting compensated for that. So I say that inequality reflects something valuable, right? The person, if the universal basic income is enough to live on, then you have the option of, and you still have the option of getting a job. Final point on that matter, I think it would be easier to get a job because a lot of people would stop. A lot of people would stop working if they had a universal basic income. The involuntary unemployment and involuntary employment would cancel each other out because the people who didn't want to be working could stop, and then the people who wanted to get a job could take their place. So you're going to have employee, and in general, it would favor the labor side of the economy. So if I've got more money, I'm less desperate for the job. It's easier for me to quit. It's easier for me to strike. I don't need to, I might take fewer shifts. That means there's less hours available in the economy, and employers have to bid up the price of the remaining hours. When they do that, then you're earning more per hour. I need to work even fewer hours to cover my rent. Go ahead, Josh.
And can I just raise this idea of, imagine if people could strike theoretically indefinitely, withhold your labor and say, no, I'm not coming back. I've got enough money to feed myself. Pay me more for this job, or I'm not coming back, and nobody will do it. Just imagine how differently that would change the labor market.
Yeah, it's really weird. So a lot of people seem to think, oh, what would happen with the UBI is that all the money would end up with Jeff Bezos because, and like they hear that tech billionaires are in favor of it, which is true. There are some tech billionaires who are in favor of it. There's plenty of wealthy people who are against it. Don't worry. But we could talk about that and why the tech industry supports a UBI in a little bit. That's, I think, an interesting question. But they go, well, what'll happen is they know they don't want to pay good wages, so they want to give everyone a UBI. They want the government to pay the wages, so they don't have to pay their workers. And then they'll still collect all the money because we'll spend it all at Amazon or shopping on, Facebook ads or whatever, right? But of course, they're still going to need people to work in the warehouses, right? Until Josh works in automation. So until even then, there's still going to be labor required for all of these businesses. And that labor will be negotiating from a position of non-desperation. That labor will be able to turn down the job and walk away. So they'll have to pay more to get people in. And the labor share of income across the economy, I believe, will go up. And involuntary unemployment, I imagine, would almost disappear. And we had a situation like that. I remember talking to a bloke, a boomer, if you will, who was, talking about the labor market in the 60s. He goes, I quit a job in the morning and then I got a new one in the afternoon. Right? Like the labor market can be in a position where there's plenty of times where labor is scarce and the employers have to compete to get the workers. That's happened. We can recreate that scenario.
Yeah, if you don't employ women, it's pretty easy to. Yeah.
Well, that's one factor. I think it's also interesting to imagine that, okay, so there was a certain point at which, let's just imagine that consumption is fixed, just to simplify things, right? And you've got the workforce that at a middle-class life, people won't work anymore. Once then they need to meet a middle-class lifestyle where you have your own house, your own car, etc. The economy is always getting more productive, right? Technology is always improving the amount of output. So we can imagine that actually between the 50s and the 70s, there was just a period where productivity times the labor force equaled consumption. So before that, people had to be poor. Before that, even everyone working couldn't provide a middle-class income for everybody. Then there was a sweet spot in the middle of the 20th century where everyone working, or all the men working, one earner per household was exactly the right amount to produce the output needed for everyone to have a comfortable life. And now we only need it. Yeah.
That was always also the most conformist period in history. People were traumatized by World War II. All they wanted to do was work. And there were shiny new things like cars and stuff coming out. That was good for 20 years and then it just exploded. Everyone just went manic with drugs and rock and roll and everything. So,
well, another thing that happened potentially is that now we don't need the whole economy. We don't need everybody working for a full time to produce.
we never did. Yeah.
No, exactly. But now the percentage of the workforce that's required to produce all the necessities is smaller and smaller. So there's this gap between the people we need to produce enough and the available source of labor. So the jobs guarantee is just trying to ignore that fundamental dynamic, ignore the fact that we have more and more, that productivity is diminishing the need for labor. And a jobs guarantee just doesn't really reckon with that fundamental thing, which is only going to increase. Like productivity is still, is still increasing. Every hour of labor is more and more productive. And so the idea is, I guess, that we're all just meant to keep increasing our consumption to meet the output, and that seems a bit crazy.
I always think about how for almost all of history, most people worked as farmers because everybody had to work as farmers. And then today it's 1 or 2%. It's minuscule.
Yeah.
So that means that 90%, the other 90 plus, whoever knows exactly how much, have been put into new jobs that have just been made up on the fly. And it's only been the last couple 100 years where it's changed this way.
Well, I mean, yeah, we can think, if we go back, I mean, look, yeah, even like in the pre-war years, at the start of the 20th century, like huge numbers of Americans were still holding farmers. In Australia, all throughout the West, it was the same. Huge numbers of people were still farmers, right? It wasn't a rare thing to be a farmer. It was a normal thing. Now it's like, it's a very specialized profession done by a small number of people with a lot of technology. But if we go back to the pre-modern era and we imagine you get in a time machine, and you travel back to the era before the Industrial Revolution, and you go and you talk to some peasant farmer, and he doesn't, apart from the local priest, he doesn't know anybody who's not a farmer, right? People who aren't farmers are like celebrities in this era. Everyone's a farmer. It's 99% of people or something are farmers. And you say, well, we're going to come up with this great technology, and what it's going to allow people to do is we're going to have 1% of the population produce enough food for everybody else. And you'd say, well, what's everybody else going to do? Are they all going to sit around and drink beer and wait for the harvest festival? I don't understand. How are they going to live their lives? You say, oh, no, they'll all get jobs. And he'd say, what? Because the social institution of a job didn't really exist, right? And so what happened is we came up with all these new, like there were tasks, there was work that needed to be done, but employment wasn't a normal thing. What happened was you were a serf or you were a peasant, and your social relations meant that you paid a rent for the land that you were on, in crops or whatever, and then you ate the food that you produced, right? The idea that you would get paid money and buy food for performing some other task, and then you'd say, well, what's a job? And you'd say, well, for example, I'm an automation engineer who works as a consultant for supply chain companies, and they would say, what do any of those words mean? Right? And so that's where we are now, is we're those peasants, and people say, well, what's going to happen? What are we all going to do? And it's, there'll be stuff to do. There'll be tasks, there'll be work, but the social institutions which deliver those work, the social institutions which structure that work will change dramatically. And we should be absolutely certain that that's going to be the case long term, right? So work survived, farming survived, all of the key economic functions that were taking place all kept happening, but feudalism didn't survive, right? And so that's where we are now. So in a sense, you would say, well, actually capitalism as we know it, or whatever you want to call the mixed economy system that we live under now, that won't survive another 200, 300 years, right? Things are going to change, and we need new social institutions.
Well, I was thinking about, like, the bourgeois took over from feudalism, and they justified it kind of through the work ethic. It was part of the middle class was a working, how how do I say it? They imposed the work ethic on society, and work regulated the whole of society, which didn't happen before. And so I think the question now is, how do you replace the work ethic? Because there's nothing there to replace it. All that comes up is more jobs. How do you regulate society? How do you plan society? All you can do is plan for more wage labourers to behave like wage labourers. And that's what the political class is going on about.
I've got a response. I think that's why a basic income is the perfect transition, because it's not saying let's abolish all jobs. That's not what a basic income would achieve. But what it does do is it allows people to step back and take time away and think about their lives and think about their priorities and think about what a life could mean without employment being at the center of it. So I feel like it's the perfect stepping stone to whatever the next thing is, which nobody knows what the next thing is. But a basic income helps us see and feel out that road a bit more clearly. Does that make sense?
But do you have like a name for, like, because work, you get a job, it's understood as an ethic. You deserve an income because you work. And that's kind of,
well, what we're saying
is a mystical understanding.
Yeah, and what we're saying is you deserve an income and you deserve to live just by being a human, right? And then you can deserve more than that on top by earning extra. You can earn, everybody gets to eat, everybody gets a house, everybody gets, enough for basic transport needs and so on. But if you want to, and the internet, yes, absolutely, communication is human, right? I need it. I can't live without bandwidth. I was just watching Ready Player One, and they talk about the bandwidth riots of whenever it was, and I was like, I can imagine that. That probably started in Australia with our crappy NBN. Anyhow, but like then you get extra for being, if you can find a way to contribute to society that's really valuable, then what you get is extra income, and that's still a reward for work. So what we're saying is that there's some intrinsic value. We're not saying all value is intrinsic. Right, and I think it's worth considering that. There was a great piece in the Guardian about how they said, this is a few years ago now, but it was very well put, and it was that basic income is a birthright, and it's a birthright because we all should have right to self-sustenance, but we don't. So I can't go out I live in a rural area, and there's plenty of trees and forest and fish around, but I can't go out and start chopping down trees and build myself a hut in the forest, right? I need to own that land. I need to buy it with cash. So I'm forced into the cash economy. And so this article started with so everyone's heard of the Magna Carta, probably, which was that was the rights of the lords, and the rights of the lords to not be subject to the king's arbitrary injustice and stuff like that. Well, 200 years after that, there was another document that was extremely important in English law for a long time. It was called the Charter of the Forest. And it said that the peasants would have access to common land. They'd be able to graze their animals. They'd be able to plant crops. They'd be able to gather wood. They'd be able to hunt. They'd be able to support themselves from by directly taking their sustenance from nature, right? And then you had the Enclosures Act, which was one of the things that, that what Stephen was talking about was that how people were disciplined into becoming the working class. One of the things was to deny them access to land. So they couldn't go get firewood from the forest to keep warm. They couldn't go, set traps and catch fish and do all of those things. They had to earn currency. And if you didn't have currency, you didn't have access to the necessities of life. And you can see there's laws against vagabondism and all of these things to force people into the modern economy. And so long as what we're actually doing is restoring a version of it. This is Thomas Paine's argument as well. He says that because of private property, I'm not actually free to live independently. Because of the market and the state keeping me away from the rivers and land, and of course people it's normally talked about as an individual, but you can imagine a collective as well. So me and a group of people might decide, well, we could all go out into the forest and clear a patch of land and grow potatoes or whatever and live independently. If we try that, then the police will come, right? Will end up being there'll be coercion preventing us from making an independent living. So what you can suggest is that the UBI is actually a compensation for that right to self sustenance being taken away. I mean, I don't think you really, this is where I'm a philosophy student. What you realize is that you just sort of pick your starting points, right? This is why the brilliance of the American Declaration of Independence was we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's like, we're not going to argue about this. And really, I think that's where we have to end up, is just saying it is self-evident to us that everybody deserves to live. Even the, you know, like when someone commits a murder and we put them in prison, we still, you know, we cover their cost of living there, right? But somehow it's unacceptable for people who are outside, who haven't committed a crime. They don't deserve to have their cost. You know what I mean? They're not moral enough somehow to be taken care of.
So are you kind of anticipating that UBI might be almost a constitutional type referendum style?
I have no idea. I have no idea how it'll come about. I think we're pretty close, actually, because I think what's happened with COVID is not just that, everything's been turned off for a little while. Many processes which were already happening have been accelerated. So automation has been accelerated, right? Like,
can I hold you back up there? I think jobs have made a big fight back during this time. Like, I thought they were going to get hammered by this. I thought people were going to go, universal basic income is the way to manage a pandemic. It is the way to manage the good times as well. And yet jobs have seemingly, you know, even kind of got stronger. Like, people want jobs.
Do they?
What do you mean? What do you mean by got stronger?
Oh, like you would expect, you know, the coalition or Labor to say jobs, we want to create jobs, we want to get people back to work, etc. But there hasn't been a backlash from, like, you take the Life movement, they seem very pro-work, like, get people to get a job, that's your future, is your job. And there wasn't the kind of if you underpin society with the UBI, you manage these problems a lot better. Instead, they're trying to, you know, tweak the welfare system instead, which is...
So I think the reason for that is, sorry, I'm bursting to...
I can see how excited you were.
I think the reason for that is because the left in Australia is so dominated by unions. And the core of what a union is it's representing you at work. And so having people at work is really important for unions. And unions tend to not be crazy about basic income for that reason.
Yeah.
And the... I guess you'd call it the human rights movement of Australia is not big. So why are you seeing that response? It's because the Labor movement is massive and the human rights movement isn't.
I think that's a big part of it. I also think it's just the ideological inertia of the thing. Like, part of what I was saying before is about that it's not far off, is that the crisis is going to roll on after we get a vaccine. Assuming even we get a vaccine, you know, late this year, early next year, best case scenario, the economy's taken this huge hit. And without the pandemic occurring, when the pandemic isn't actually happening, it's going to be harder for conservatives, especially, to justify, you know, making an exception and not, you know, forcing people back into work. And so they're going to try. And, you know, everyone's going to try and deal with it. Everyone's always fighting the last war, as they say. So I think what we'll see is there's going to be an attempt to go back to snap back and go back to the way the economy was before. And that's not going to work. And that's when we'll see people sort of, it'll go from impossible to inevitable in a shorter period of time than might seem, you know, when the crisis gets, when we realize that the pandemic's gone and we still can't get things to go back the way they were, you know. So people are working from home more, and a lot of companies have said they're going to keep working from home, right? So what about the Uber drivers and the people who ran the cafe at the bottom of their office block, and all the people who were employed supporting that workplace, right? What about all the construction workers who don't need to build a new office block because that office block is now vacant, and when a new business opens up, they can go there. They don't need, the demand for commercial real estate is going to shrink. A lot of people have made their first online purchase, right? I remember making my first online purchase not that like, a year or two ago, and it's like, it gets pretty addictive, right? Like once you realize, and it just shows up and I didn't have to go anywhere. That was kind of cool, And a lot of people are now getting experience with online shopping. So retailers are going to have a very hard time coming back. There was already a lot of sort of marginal retail businesses that were just kind of limping along. Not only have they taken a hit now and racked up a bunch of debt and lost earnings, but they have, they're going to have customers who have learned online shopping now. Go ahead, Josh.
I think it's also worth noting, look at how quickly things changed before. Like within the span of a couple weeks, bam, Centrelink doubled, Let's just say Centrelink doubled all the payments. And that shift can happen quickly. And I think people have also realized that shift can happen quickly. Like it's, would you say that's fair, Stephen? Oh, he's frozen.
Stephen?
Am I frozen?
No, you're not frozen.
Oh, no.
Stephen might be frozen. Or he's just sitting very still.
Can you repeat?
I was just going to say...
my internet connection. Sorry.
Okay.
I think you were saying how quickly... I was surprised that they doubled it. That was astonishing. But now you think, well, they probably doubled it for the stimulus effects. Mm-hmm. It was kind of like Labor sending out $1,000 checks. It wasn't like, we'll keep doing this. It's like, let's just do this for 6 months and then back to normal.
So, yeah, but normal is going to be elusive, is my bet. And as Josh was saying, things could change really fast. I mean, he's using the example of what happened with the pandemic, where we went from I'm going to the footy, everything's fine, to everyone stay home and here's $1,000. A fortnight, right? That was in the space of a week. So we don't know what that next sort of panic moment will be, but it may be when they start lowering the payments again, and all of a sudden, the economy goes off a cliff and they realize, wait a minute, this isn't right. But what we have at the moment is essentially a temporary guaranteed minimum income, right? Like everyone in Australia, because with the cancellation of mutual obligations, it's a lot like a guaranteed minimum income in the sense that almost everyone's covered. Like, we've got millions of people.
Not everyone.
Sorry?
I will just note, I feel like we're basically there. If we define a basic income as an unconditional livable wage for every citizen, then most people in Australia have that, except there are some categories of people who miss out. Like the people who are who don't have a house and can't get enrolled in the job seeker payments. People who are carers, I don't think got the doubled rate, and people who are disabled, I don't think got the doubled rate either.
So they already had a higher rate.
Each category.
The disability pension was already about $900 a fortnight. So they didn't get it, but they are now getting less than able-bodied unemployed people, which doesn't seem fair. If anything, they have other costs they have to deal with. In terms of a disabled taxi is more expensive than a normal one. Et cetera, et cetera. But, and as well, I know actually you're right, people on the NEIS program, a new employment initiative scheme, which is people who are doing the right thing and trying to start a business, the right thing, and trying to start a business, they missed out. They've got the old payment. So a friend of mine is on that, and he's missing out because he's officially self-employed. Although, he's an artist and a graphic designer, and he was, supplying cafes and stuff with menus, for example, and cafes aren't buying any menus at the moment, right? People are, he's trying to switch and sell t-shirts online, but there are cracks. And this is the thing is it's almost like people want there to be cracks. That's what I feel. There's this this is where, I think the ideological side of it is really strong. And when, what ideology is what you don't have to say. Ideology is all about taboo and fetish, right? And the thing about a taboo, we'll start with fetish. Fetish is where you give something powers that it doesn't have. Not in the sense of sex fetish, but in the sense of a fetish is where you imagine that a certain object or activity has powers beyond what it really does. So employment isn't just a way to get things done. It sort of validates you as a human being, and it has all these other meanings. So I think we have a work fetish and we have a laziness taboo. And the thing about a taboo is not only are you meant to know the rule, you're meant to not say it, right? And so no one actually says, I want there to be people who are in poverty. There needs to be people who are lazy need to be punished, right? That's not really said. That what they say is, they get close to it when they say there needs to be a strong incentive to work. But it's as if that fear of destitution is completely gone, then they're worried how the population will behave. And that's, it's a basic lack of faith in people, as well, as far as I can tell.
Sorry, this is just kind of a nice little moment. I just wanted to shout out again, just a reminder to ZJ, Jeff, and Noreen, if you've got any questions, feel free to jump in. Just throwing it out there.
Anyone? We only have we're going to start wrapping up now. So now's a great time to come up with questions. Noreen, I know you've got one. No? All good. Jeff's all good.
Greens? Are you going to make a comment on the Greens?
I will say that Abigail Boyd from the Illawarra Greens is great. She's an absolute champion. But what I've just realized is, because they have what they call the unconditional wellness payment, unconditional well-being payment, but that's a New South Wales Greens thing. That's not a national policy. So that's a state policy. And it says, no, everyone in New South Wales will give, 1,100 a fortnight to unconditionally. But that's not what the National Greens. The National Greens, led by Adam Bant, are going for a jobs guarantee, which, I mean, of course, isn't even practical now if we're in the middle of a pandemic and we need people to stay.
Has Adam Bant ever talked about universal basic income?
I think so.
Oh,
I've talked to him a couple of times, and he so Greens Labour Party is not decided by the head, the party leader, right? But on a personal level, I've talked to him, and he is not personally interested. So there are definitely factions within Greens, and it's been party policy for about 20 years. But it's just, as we were saying before, you've kind of got to get a consensus in order to push something forward in a political sense, and there is not consensus within the Greens.
I think Adam Bant is the most pointless person in Australian politics, because he's taken the Greens and said, now we're going to stop standing up for what we believe in and start triangulating and trying to, move to the centre and become electable. And the party's plateaued. It's not working. They're not getting more votes by doing it. If you're going to be too timid to say what you really think, and you're going to try and sort of second guess the voters and tell them what they want to hear, why not just join the Labor Party, right? That's the Labor Party's there as this, as a big tent party of compromise, and we'll meet the voters where they are, rather than campaigning on a pure principle. It's a mix of principle and pragmatism. So what's the point of the Greens if they're not going to stand up for, the radical, interesting option? I almost went along to an Adam Bant webinar to make this point, where he was talking about the jobs guarantee and their green recovery program. It's their version of the Green New Deal. And I think they should think very hard about what happened to the Australian Democrats. Now, the Australian Democrats, for those who don't remember the deep, dark days of, the dark, distant past of the 90s, were the third party in Australia. They were bigger than the Greens. And they had seats in Parliament. They were a thing, right?
Somebody used to come to this group. Somebody used to come to this group, used to write policy for the Democrats, and I thought, who cares? Who cares? I don't know this party.
No, they were a big deal. And then they blew themselves up on the issue of the GST, because they made a deal with the coalition, and they controlled that. It was like the Greens and the carbon tax. It was this, you know what I mean? It was one of these things where the government needs a minor party to get something through. And they agreed to let the GST through, and they thought they could explain it away to their voters. And, look for them now. They are gone. They are Dunsky. And I think that the issue of the moment now is a UBI. And it's really, you can see it if you look at Google Trends and you look at what people are searching for. People are curious about a UBI. No one's Googling jobs guarantee.
Do you know of any groups or individuals kind of shouting it out loud?
That's us. Basic Income Australia.
idiot celebrities and like, I don't know, just people on TV and stuff.
I know
Not
Maggie
really.
Sabansky endorsed it. Sorry.
Oh, well, if we got Magda, we should have, can we get her to
It
come
was-
to one of these? People will show
It
up
was
for
a
her.
few
They're
years
not gonna-
ago.
Yeah. Well, let's try and get her back. That's great. I can't think of many in Australia. Lots of people in the US and lots of people in the UK and lots of people in Europe are talking about it. In a sense, Australia will probably be the last because we often are anyhow. It didn't used to be the case. We were the first place with the 8-hour day that said workers didn't have to work 10 hours a day and 6 days a week. But we seem to be a little bit slower nowadays, and also because our current welfare provisions are more generous, at the moment at least, than what's happening in the US or whatever. So there's less of a burning need for change, or it's a smouldering need for change rather than a red hot, agonizing need for change. But with what I was going to say about the Greens is because they're not in favour of it at the moment, I think that could be their GST in reverse moment. This could be the time when they, by being on the wrong side of an issue, they remove their relevance. ZJ, did you have a point?
Yeah, well, don't we need to raise the GST to pay for the UBI?
See, this is where we get into the monetary politics. Sorry, Stephen?
Not if you don't want to.
Yeah.
That's all I'm interested in, because I don't know how we're gonna pay for it. You know?
The way we would pay for it, I believe, is that the government would either go into debt to pay for it and then tax back that money later, right? So when the government spends, that money circulates in the Australian economy and that increases GDP. And so what you can see it all the time. If you actually look at the history of deficits and spending, most OECD countries are in deficit most year, yet their debt to GDP ratio does not blow out, right? Because that money doesn't disappear. They spend it into the economy. The people who receive it spend it. The people who the businesses they spend it at then spend it, and it circulates in the economy, grows the economy, and that's where our money supply comes from, actually. But
doesn't that assume it's like everyone's like a non-Apple? Because Apple just takes a bunch of money from Australia and just sends it to the Cayman Islands or something, Because like that money's gone.
Yeah. Look, this is where I don't think you can get away from the discussion about the role of taxes in financing the government. And I believe, and this is increasingly the case, that the government doesn't tax then spend, right? That the two things are basically disconnected from each other. The actual limit on government spending isn't what their tax revenues are, it's inflation. So the government can print money, right? And the reason it doesn't just always print what money for everything it needs is because if it prints too much money, there'll be inflation, the dollar will drop. But for the last 10 years, the Reserve Bank has been failing to meet its inflationary targets. Inflation has been too low, which is why you had, the raving communists at the Australian Business Council last year, before the coronavirus, saying that welfare payments should be increased, because we need to put more money in people's hands to fend off deflation. So the real reason, the real budgetary constraint on the government, the real reason it shouldn't run a huge deficit is inflation, not that it's going to go broke. It issues the Australian dollar. It can't run out, right? So what can happen is that dollar can lose value, but we're nowhere near that level at the moment. And because people aren't spending at the moment, because the pandemic has limited spending, we have more space for the government to spend and for the government to stimulate spending by giving people money before we hit that inflationary barrier. So we pay for it by printing money is my answer. Other people have different answers.
Yeah, but that's the central problem with printing money like that is just, if you think about the retiree with like 300,000 in the bank, they think they're gonna retire comfortably on that. They're just looking for interest from the bank, and actually, I'm gonna pick up my dinner because they're just outside. Okay, sorry.
Okay, great. No, that's fine.
Can I ask a question then?
Please do, Naren.
Is there an estimate on how much a universal basic income in Australia would cost?
I'm sure there are some. I don't have one hand.
Not this big scary number again.
It's
Well, just because I heard a sort of fun fact that probably isn't quite true, but just that it costs so much to administer Centrelink that if you just didn't do that and put the like 200 billion that it costs to administer Centrelink, so universal basic income, that would cover like a significant chunk of it.
What she's saying is that if you got rid of the administrative costs of running Centrelink, and you just took all of, and some people suggest doing this, you get rid of all the Centrelink payments and and Centrelink staff and all of this, and you make the universal basic income that gets you a chunk of the way there from the numbers I've seen. It doesn't quite get you there, but it gets you a lot of it. Josh, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I looked it up a while back and I asked myself, how much does Centrelink spend on staffers? And it's about 2 billion, between 2 and 3 billion, which is not enough.
Chump change.
Yeah.
barely a Collins class submarine. Sorry, go on,
Isn't
Steve.
UBI a redistribution of wealth? You're not actually buying. You're not buying money.
You can do it that way. You can do it either way. So there's people who say, well, what we do is we increase income taxes X amount and we give it to and we pay it out that amount out as a UBI, right? And
I remember one where you tax half from capital and half from income tax, and most people on income tax, they get it back through the UBI anyway. So
yeah. So you have a zeroing out point somewhere around the median income. If you just make it only income taxes, you can do it that way.
Yeah,
and what that means is it's just redistributing income from rich people to poor people. That's all it is, and there's no overall increase or change to the budget, right? But I don't think the reason, how do you pay for it? There are many answers, but I just ZJ, are you back? Because I wanted to get to your point about retirees and saving.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, so this is actually what's happening at the moment. My dad's trying to retire, and he's trying to figure out if his savings are going to pay enough interest, right? And so he's going through this exact issue at the moment. And one of the things, his big problem is that interest rates are so low. So why are interest rates so low? Because we're at risk of deflation. Deflation is the enemy right now. Deflation is, as I said before, what keeps central bankers up at night, right? And if UBI has some inflationary pressure, one of the ways to respond to that would be to increase interest rates. And that would do a lot of things. One thing is it would drive down house prices because people would be more likely to sell and less likely to buy because they don't want to take on debt when there's higher interest rates. And it would increase the returns for savers, which then in turn, has its own effect where people are more likely to save because they can get higher interest rates on it, so they don't spend that money. So you're more likely to put the money in the bank than put it in a house in that scenario, right? When interest rates are higher. So if we actually want to improve the situation for savers, and we want to improve the situation for people who have savings and want to make interest on those savings, we want to raise interest rates. We can't do that at the moment because if we cut off that supply of cheap money to the economy, we'll have a deflationary spiral like the Depression. If we had a UBI in place, which was not covered by taxes, but which was just the government spending money, that would increase inflationary pressure at the bottom, so to speak. So you can decrease it at the top by raising interest rates, and that would be better for savers.
That sounds fine and logical, but if we follow that logic and we push that idea, right? And what then comes is that when the inflation do improve, they will go, then we can take away the UBI, right? So it's not a permanent argument for UBI, if you know what I mean.
UBI could be treated as another one of these monetary levers, but we have multiple of them. We have taxes are a monetary lever. Interest rates are a monetary lever. Government spending is a monetary lever. So first thing we should do is obviously cut politicians' pays, right? Like, just for the hell of it anyhow. It won't make a macro difference, but we probably should. But
that's a funny thing because I think it should be different. I think we should increase politicians pay so we can actually attract good people to these positions and not have clowns running around doing random stuff.
Well, if there's any way to increase, yeah.
Prime Minister of Australia is one of the most expensive prime ministers in the world.
He makes about 400K? 400K?
400K, yeah.
Gets
Paying
500.
them the way to attract good people, and you attract people that aren't interested in money. Pay it to the teachers and good nurses.
Well, currently we are attracting a lot of people that aren't interested in money. They're interested in God knows what, you know, but look at what happens.
Power and attention.
Yeah.
I think they're interested in money. I think they're interested in money.
Inclined if they are interested in, not interested in money, but the politician will always get paid less than a comparable position in private industry. But we just don't want to pay them so little that you end up with just people who are actually better off being a politician.
This is an interesting. I mean, like, I don't think we want Richard Branson coming across. You know, we don't want Twiggy Forrester or you know, one of these. Dick Smith, maybe. I mean, he tried to run for office, didn't he?
I think he endorsed UBI.
Did he really?
I think so. Give me a sec.
That'd be good to know. Well, Dick Smith and Magnus Sabansky, should be, you know, we should be away to the races. No, but so we have all these different monetary levers, and at the moment, with the main one, of course, is interest rates, and that's put to its most inflationary setting, and it has been for ages because they're fighting a losing war against deflationary pressures. You want a small amount of inflation every year. You know, you want the target rate is 2%. That's what they've come up with, and they have a hard time hitting that, and that's why interest rates are so low. Sorry?
They never get close to the inflation target.
Yeah. They haven't been hitting it, and they haven't been hitting their jobs targets, and they haven't been hitting any of the things that they've been predicting. And arguably that's to do with how their models work and how they think about these things. But what Noreen raised as well is the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, right? So if a person is motivated by money, then they're thinking about money. Whereas if they're motivated by the love of what they're doing, then they're thinking about what they're doing. So
yeah, no, see, that's where it's a bit counterintuitive, because if you think about the school system, they go, well, let's pay the teachers. Basically, well, for example, a math teacher, if someone's good at math nowadays, they could go into programming or go into banking and make double or triple what a teacher normally makes. And go, well, we are not interested in people that are interested in money. We want people that want to help kids and teach. Well, I mean, the economics of it means that you're not going to attract people with math skills into teaching. And that's exactly what's going to happen. It's counterintuitive. Like, it's like, if you don't want to spend any money, you end up attracting people that, yeah, you have a good group of people that are interested in teaching for the love of teaching, but there's a lot of people that are like, nah, I just want to make a good living. Why don't I go into banking or programming or something else? You know, like it's human nature. You can't. Well,
I do know someone who's got a PhD in maths who dropped out of banking so they could teach. Their husband stayed in banking.
I'm 100% sure there are such people, but we have to apply statistical thinking here.
Yeah.
How rare is that? Is that guy an outlier? Like out of 50 people, is that one person, or like?
It's a she, and I don't know what the stats are. But here's talking about stats and studies, right? It's established within education that, at least amongst the people, first of all, let's raise teachers' pay. First of all, no, I don't think anyone here is going to object to that. I certainly think that we should be paying teachers more. But secondly, what I'd say is that there's actually studies that have been done on this that show that, at least with learning and with cognitively difficult tasks, the people who are motivated intrinsically by an actual interest in what they're doing perform better than people who are motivated extrinsically. So leaving aside ability, you have two people of equal ability, right? The person who's interested in the task is going to perform better than the person who's not interested in the task, right? And that when you have tasks of cognitive difficulty, a high monetary reward can actually make performance worse because it pressurizes it. And, you know, actually, if you're relaxed, you're going to think more clearly. If you're just trying to do it, right? If you're just trying to solve the riddle, then you're more likely to pull it off. If you're like, oh, I have to solve the riddle because then I can afford, you know, to buy a new house, then that pressure is actually going to be counterproductive. And there's lots of studies that are done on that. And what a UBI would be doing is helping us shift from a society where our work is motivated by extrinsic motivations to where it's motivated by intrinsic motivations. And that will actually produce better results. Like Isaac Newton didn't invent physics because there was a prize to invent modern physics. No one knew what was going, you know, he invented it by sitting around and asking himself abstract questions like, does the moon also fall? Right? It was this, and most of the Renaissance, most of the Enlightenment came out of what were leisure activities, not out of paid work. Right? So these big breakthroughs don't happen because we're paying people a breakthrough bonus. Right? They happen because people have an intrinsic interest in what they're trying to achieve. And I think if might be a good place to start wrapping up. Obviously we'll have final questions, but one good thing about a UBI is it would increase the amount of stuff that's happening in our society because that people are doing just because they love to do it. And that would be a good thing for everyone as well. And it's a good thing inherently. Now, maybe let's have final questions or comments and we'll wrap up there because we're come to the end of our time. Josh, surely you've got something to add?
I think I found a Facebook group from Dick Smith. I'm trying to track this back. I'm pretty sure he's endorsed it around the time I moved to Melbourne. And I found a Facebook post from Dick Smith Fair Go supporters. And they're saying we've been campaigning for a basic income for years. Don't worry about me.
Well, I think you just figured out, you called it before, it should be called a citizen's dividend. No, in Australia, it's going to be the Fair Go payment.
Fair Go dividend, yeah.
Fair Go, that's the name, you know, in America, Andrew Yang called it the freedom dividend because that's what tested best. I reckon the Fair Go payment is the go. Anyhow, is it Stephen or Stefan? I've been saying, I haven't even known. Yeah, Stephen, sorry, Stephen.
It's Stefan when I'm in France, but yeah.
Okay. Are you often in France?
A couple of times, but yeah, not recently. Yeah.
So any final thoughts?
Like, one of the things that I love about UBI is it just leaves people alone. Like being questioned, being forced to fill out forms or being asked, you know, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's like, well, I don't know, just leave me alone.
I'm all for it.
Yeah.
You know, I like to say that the minute you have to explain yourself, you stop being free, right? Like the minute you have to sort of justify your motives and your actions, and when someone's like, well, but you know, explain yourself to me, then you know, then you're free, right? Then you're not free. You're all of a sudden under this position where now I've got to commit myself to a certain narrative of what I'm doing with my time and what my motivations are, and then that can be thrown back in my face next week when they come in, and you're like, well, actually now I'm thinking about looking for a job in this field, right? And they're like, well, you know, next week, your motivations or your interests have changed. It's like, no, you've said that this was your plan, and now you've got to stick to it. So I agree that people have a right to be left alone. That's if you visit the third world, if you spend time in like slums in the third world, right? Which I've done a little bit of working as a journalist. It's the number one thing that's unbearable about it is that you are not left alone. It's this social claustrophobia of people constantly in each other's faces. What are you doing? Where are you going? Why? Right? People don't have personal space, and that's an economic issue because they literally don't physically have space from each other. And so a UBI is an extension of that, you know, that idea. I actually, something that I think is interesting and fits with UBI, we talk about social democracy a lot, or democratic socialism. There's a term from the middle of last century that I like. It's called social liberalism. And it's like, yeah, we want all that good stuff about equality and economic justice and stuff, but we do it through the lens of individual rights, right? That's why it's social liberalism rather than social democracy, because it focuses on the individual. And, you know, first among those rights is negative freedom, the right to just be left alone. So I agree. Noreen, do you have a final thought or question? No? All good? ZJ? No, nothing from ZJ. I think we've convinced him that his reservations have been overcome in terms of how we pay for it. I'll take that as a win. And I guess we'll leave it there for the night. All right. Thanks, guys. Josh, do you want to do an announcement about the action meeting on Saturday?
Oh yeah, so every month we're doing Introduction to Basic Income meetings, which is what you're at right now. But then on the following Saturday, we have a action group. So if you're keen to help us push the, Stephen, you were saying before, how come nobody's talking about it? Saturday's when we're trying to get it in the debate somehow. So I'm working on an article about how to pay for it, and I've made some animations for that, and the animations are working. Yes. Yeah, everybody's got their own little projects, and sometimes we collaborate, and sometimes we just check in and share what we're up to.
This event came out of those meetings. We said we should do a public facing webinar every month to get people on board. So when we try to think up new things like chasing down Magda Sabansky or Dick Smith, and see if we can get them on board as well.
And just quickly, where do you think it's biggest, like UBI in Australia? Like, is it biggest in Melbourne? Like, do you get a feeling?
I mean, if you're talking politicians, New South Wales Greens tend to be quite into it because they've got, what was her name? Abigail Boyd.
Boyd.
Yeah. And there's also there's another guy, I can't remember his name right now. But there's a few people who are elected in New South Wales Greens who are into it.
There's this guy who's like 12 years old or something. Actually, I should say he's like 18 or 19, called Finn something or other. I can't remember his name right now. Maybe Finn Armstrong Schmidt. He's got a hyphenated name, right? And he's running as an independent in Queensland for some seat in Queensland, and he's pro UBI. He's pretty interesting. I mean, he's got a lot of energy, and he's and a lot of ideas. He's the kind of a young kid. So he's from Queensland. So I don't think he's got much support there. Yeah.
I will just say that there are lots of people in Australia who endorse it, but what's really, really difficult is getting everybody together in the same place at the same time. That's like the biggest challenge I've had in the group for the last 3 years. So like there are lots of people, but they're all over the place and they're very separate and disconnected.
And we don't really have one major champion the way that, someone like Andrew Yang has become the champion for it in the United States. I'm trying to get Josh to do it. Josh to run for office or something on a UBI platform.
What about Loriana Luciani? She's good.
Yeah, she's good. We should get her to run for something too. She's more of an academic, isn't she?
Yeah, she's just finished a PhD paper on the feasibility of a basic income. So talking about like the social narratives around it.
That's interesting. I wonder if she does much about the labor market, because I think there's a lot of arguments. There's a lot of stuff about the labor markets, which is really just assumed and not thought through about how a UBI would affect that. So let's try and get her on the next one.
Hers was more like the psychology of like what narratives are convincing to people and that kind of thing. Yeah. Awesome.
So the answer is that I think, Melbourne and Sydney would be, but I wonder if that's to do with the Greens. New South Wales Greens, used to have what's her name? Oh, I've forgotten her name now. She was basically a socialist.
Lee Rhiannon.
Lee Rhiannon. Right. So the Lee Rhiannon faction within the Greens in New South Wales is very strong, and I think that might explain some of the economic.
David Shoebridge.
David Shoebridge. He's pro UBI, is he? Oh, he's great. I walked up a mountain with him a couple of years ago.
Oh, really?
He does. Yeah,
he loves those walks.
Yeah, he does Greens bushwalks. He goes around the country and does bushwalks with people and talks politics. So that was good fun. Good bloke. Maybe we'll try and get him on one of these sometime soon if we can't get Magda Sabansky. Right. All right, guys.
Would that be to get Magda?
Let's do it. It's going to be possible. Everyone, if you're watching this and you know Magda, tell her to get in touch. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.